As King Alcinous celebrates his guest and prepares to send him on his way, a looming question comes closer and closer to the forefront of everyone's mind, including ours. Who is this stranger? Hello and welcome back. My name is Zachary May, and today we are reading the great books of Western civilization together, continuing with the Odyssey. This is the Robert Fagles translation, Book 8. As morning breaks, Athena disguises herself as Alcinous's herald before running about the town and urging anyone she can find to come to the meeting grounds to learn more about this mysterious stranger that he is hosting. Alcinous and Odysseus themselves, accompanied by the nobles and captains of Phaeacia, also come. Alcinous explains the plight of his guest before asking his people to prepare a ship and a crew that might take him home. Once prepared, all may attend a feast in his honor. The people do so, quickly assembling a crew and selecting a ship before coming to the palace. At this feast, a blind bard named Demodocus sings for all who are gathered. He sings of the feud between Odysseus and Achilles at Troy, and how Agamemnon rejoiced at this feud, for it was the sign that was prophesied to him as coming just before the fall of Troy. Hearing this song causes Odysseus to weep bitterly, which he tries to hide as best he can. Alcinous, however, notices his guest's distress, so he orders all those present to halt the feasting and instead start up a day of games and contests outside. These games feature a foot race, boxing, wrestling, and a discus throw. The captain of the armies, Laodamas, invites Odysseus to join into the games. Surely he has the skill. Odysseus refuses, citing his anguish of heart. A young sailor standing nearby overhears the conversation and begins a string of taunts and insults towards Odysseus. He calls him weak, unskilled, not a real man, and that he must be some kind of gold-grubbing merchant without any physical ability. Odysseus insults the man back, calling him stupid, and then defending his own honor by citing his experience in his travels as well as his battles. He finishes this string of insults by seizing a discus, heavier than those that are being thrown for the contest, and hurling it further than any of the Phaeacian athletes had. Having shown off his strength, Odysseus then offers to go head-to-head with anyone who would dare in wrestling, boxing, or anything else besides running. Alcinous acknowledges the wrong done to Odysseus by the sailor's taunts, but asks that Odysseus sit and not participate so that he may see what talents his people have as well, and can spread their glory when he goes home. These talents that the Phaeacians excel in are namely sailing and dancing. So now a group of dancers comes out, and the bard Demodocus emerges once more to play a song for them to dance to. The bard sings the tale of how the god Hephaestus exposed and trapped Aphrodite, his bride, and Ares, the god that she was cheating on him with. Odysseus praises the magnificent skill of both the dancers and the bard in the performance. Alcinous then asks that each of the 13 lords of the island give Odysseus a parting gift, a bar of gold and a fine garment. Meanwhile, the sailor who spoke out of turn and insulted Odysseus offers his sword to him as a gift of reconciliation. With amends made, Odysseus puts his gifts into a chest to bring with him home. Princess Nausicaa briefly emerges and approaches Odysseus, bidding him farewell and asking him to remember her always, for mainly to her he owes the gift of life. Odysseus gently pledges to honor her for the rest of his life by praying to her as if she were a goddess. By now it is dinner time, so Odysseus goes to dine with the king once more. Odysseus offers a fine choice of meat from his own portion to Demodocus, the bard, before asking him to sing the tale of the Trojan horse that Odysseus crafted to bring about the fall of Troy. As he does this, he refers to himself in the third person, for no one knows who he is yet. The bard begins to sing the tale, including how Menelaus and Odysseus themselves were the ones who broke into the house of Deiphobus, who was guarding Helen, and how they fought to win her back at last. As he sings, Odysseus weeps, like before. This time, however, the king takes the opportunity to ask him why the stories of Troy bother him so. Where is he from? Who did he know at Troy? And what happened to him in his wanderings at sea? Who is he, really? As I referred to in the intro, this chapter is full of events that work slowly to build the dramatic irony surrounding the question of Odysseus' identity. Dramatic irony, for those of you who do not know, is defined by the sense of irony that builds in the audience when they know something that the characters in the story do not. We know who Odysseus is. We know that he was a great warrior and an incredible tactician in the Trojan War, that he comes from Ithaca, and that he's married to Penelope, who, unbeknownst to him, he is in danger of losing. However, many of the characters in this chapter are unaware of these things, including Odysseus himself in some cases. As I mentioned, he does this with many events in this chapter, so we will go through them one by one. First, the tone is set, as we are told from the narrator's perspective that Odysseus, raider of cities, rose, something only we know him for. He proceeds to attend a feast in his honor, at which the bard Demodocus, who, by the way, is described suspiciously similarly to Homer himself, sings a song about the disagreement that happened between Odysseus and Achilles at Troy. Odysseus begins to weep just at the memory of the war, thinking of all he suffered, maybe, or all of his friends who died, but he hides his face so that his hosts don't see him cry. We know why he's crying, but no one else does. Hence, the dramatic irony builds. King Alcinous notices that he's crying, though. Since he does, it reminded me of the scene between Menelaus and Telemachus at Sparta. As soon as Odysseus' name was mentioned, his son Telemachus burst into tears, and it is at that moment that Menelaus realizes who his guest must be. We are not told what Alcinous is thinking when he sees Odysseus cry, but given the striking similarity between these two scenes, I believe we're meant to think that the king is beginning to theorize about who his guest might be. In any case, he calls off the rest of the feasting in order to spare Odysseus pain. Next, the king suggests a day of games and contests. For me, this recalls the day of funeral games for Patroclus back in the Iliad, at which Odysseus participated and demonstrated his skill. After all, he wrestled the giant Ajax to a standstill. With that in mind, as well as his combat experience, we know that Odysseus could participate in the games and do pretty well for himself, but the Phaeacians do not. So, after he refuses to take part in the games and Broadsea insults him and assumes that his refusal is evidence that he has no skill at all, we know exactly what's going to happen. That's the sense of dramatic irony. We know just how wrong Broadsea is. And, just like at the feast, Alcinous is the one who eventually responds thoughtfully, sensitively, and diffuses the tension, presumably adding information to any theories he may have about Odysseus' identity. While we're talking about the games, though, I'd like to point out a few minor details. First, just like in the Iliad, the smack talk between athletes is remarkably similar to the smack talk between men on the battlefield who are fighting in war. Sports allow this competitive, violent, and yet natural impulse in us an outlet where it does no damage, an essential requirement for peaceful society. If you're interested, I go into this in much more detail in my video on the Iliad Book 23, so I'll link that in the description for you. On a lighter note, though, Odysseus delivers a sick burn. It's actually a much more clever comeback than we might give him credit for. He responds to Broadsea initially by saying, "Indecent talk, my friend. So the gods don't hand out all their gifts at once, not build and brains and flowing speech to all. One man may fail to impress us with his looks, but a god can crown his words with beauty, charm, and men look on with delight when he speaks out." These words are remarkably similar to a similar passage early on in the Iliad. Back in Book 6, where Hector berates Paris for lounging around in his house instead of getting out on the battlefield and fighting, Paris offers a version of these words as an excuse for himself. Since Odysseus is saying the same thing, it leads us, the audience, to expect that he's making an excuse for himself. Until another man may look like a deathless one on high, but there's not a bit of grace to crown his words. Just like you, my fine handsome friend. Not even a god could improve those looks of yours, but the mind inside is worthless. Very suddenly, we realize he was insulting Broadsea all along. From the perspective of the audience, at least, this is a very clever comeback. This, too, is an example of dramatic irony, just centered on a different piece of information. Neither Odysseus nor the Phaeacians know what was said between Hector and Paris in his house, but we do, so only we know just how clever of a burn this is. At the dinner feast, the bard comes out again. This time, Odysseus himself asks him to sing about the Trojan War. This time about the Trojan horse, and then the fall of Troy that it brought about. He asks that this be done not out of a desire to glorify himself and his exploits, I think, but out of a desire to be known. This is something that Bernard Knox talks about in the introduction in reference to the encounter with the sirens, which we'll talk about when we get to it. It applies here too. Odysseus says to the bard, "How true to life, all too true. You sing the Achaeans' fate, all they did and suffered, all they soldiered through, as if you were there yourself, or heard from one who was. Sing of the wooden horse, the cunning trap that good Odysseus brought one day. Sing that for me, true to life as it deserves." That, by the way, is the singular, most powerful ability that literature has, wrapped up in just a few short lines. Anyways, the outcome is very predictable. Odysseus begins to weep again, and Homer compares this weeping to another familiar scene from the Iliad. As a woman weeps, her arms flung round her darling husband, a man who fell in battle, fighting for town and townsmen, seeing the man go down, dying, gasping for breath, she clings for dear life, screams and shrills, but the victors just behind her, digging spear butts into her back and shoulders, drag her off in bondage, yoked to hard labor, pain, and the most heartbreaking torment wastes her cheeks. That is Hector and Andromache, without a doubt. It's a scene that's meant to pull on our heartstrings for sure, and so it helps us to immediately understand exactly what kind of weeping we're meant to imagine going on. Anyways, with Odysseus weeping again, Alcinous finally asks what everyone has been wondering since the stranger arrived, citing the customs of hospitality. All these things are performed for him, our honored guest. The royal send-off here and gifts we give in love. So don't be crafty now, my friend. Don't hide the truth I'm after. Fair is fair. Speak out. Come, tell us the name they call you. He then begins a list of questions, each one building the dramatic irony. Consider the answers to these questions, at least those that you already know. What lands of men have you seen? Who were wild, savage, lawless? Who were friendly to strangers, God-fearing men? Tell me, why do you weep and grieve so sorely when you hear the fate of the Argives, hear the fall of Troy? Did one of your kinsmen die before the walls of Troy? Some brave man, a son by marriage, father by marriage? Or a friend, perhaps, someone close to your heart, staunch and loyal, no less dear than a brother, the brother in arms who shares our inmost thoughts. Notice how all of his guesses about why Troy bothers him so much are circling the drain, painfully close, but are never quite there. By design, he doesn't even say the most obvious answer, which is, maybe this man himself was at Troy. And since it's by design, it must be meant to increase the sense of dramatic irony, which is a perfect lead-in to the next chapter in which Odysseus finally begins the story of what happened to him after the fall of Troy. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. If you learned something new today or found something especially interesting, please comment on it down below. We can start a conversation. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.